December 16, 1943. Washington, District of Columbia. The telegram arrived at Army Ground Forces headquarters like a thunderbolt in a cloudless sky. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff himself, had overruled the decision of General Lesley McNair. 250 T26E3 tanks would enter production. The decision was final, irrevocable. It should have been a victory for the proponents of a heavier, better-armed American tank. Instead, in the office of Army Ground Forces headquarters, the reaction was one of barely contained fury. General Lesley McNair, austere, confident, inflexible, had spent 2 years blocking every attempt to accelerate production of the T26E3. To McNair, the tank represented a fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare. He had built the Army's entire doctrine around the tank destroyer concept. Light, fast vehicles carrying powerful anti-tank guns would be the hunter. Tanks themselves were to be infantry support weapons, nothing more. Heavy armor and firepower were wasteful, unnecessary, a distraction from the purity of his doctrine. But in the autumn of 1943, the shape of the war was changing in ways that doctrine could not contain. In the Soviet Union, the T-34 tank had proven to be a revelation. Armor sloped at angles that defeated German shells, a gun of impressive caliber, mobility that seemed to defy its weight. The Germans, shocked by their encounters on the Eastern Front, had responded by designing the Panther tank, essentially a German answer to the Soviet challenge, incorporating lessons learned from years of desperate fighting in Russia. Word of the Panther's specifications filtered back to American intelligence officers. The news was deeply troubling. The American M4 Sherman, the tank that McNair had championed, and that was now being produced at staggering volumes, 5,000 per month, some months more, was designed for a different war than the one developing in Europe. Its 75mm gun was adequate against the Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks that comprised the bulk of German armor. But against the Panther, against the Tiger Warfare, which had appeared in 1943 with an 88mm gun and armor that laughed at Sherman firepower, the math became increasingly unfavorable. Yet McNair would not hear it. In a letter written to General Jacob Devers in the fall of 1943, the general laid out his position with the certainty of a man who believed his doctrine to be unassailable. The M4 tank, particularly the M4A3, has been widely hailed as the best tank on the battlefield today, he wrote. There appears to be no fear on the part of our forces of the German Mark VI Tiger tank. There can be no basis for the T-26 tank other than the conception of a tank versus tank duel, which is believed unsound and unnecessary. The logic was perfect. The doctrine was pure. The only problem was that it was catastrophically wrong. But no one knew that yet. Or rather, those who suspected it lacked the authority to change policy. The men in the workshops at the tank arsenals kept their doubts private. The ordnance officers who had been developing the T-26 series continued their work slowly, methodically, always fighting the bureaucratic resistance that seemed to come from every direction except the front lines. General Devers fought on, but he was fighting uphill, fighting the entire cultural structure of the Army Ground Forces. When Marshall's order came through on December 16th, it was a small vindication. 250 T-26E3 tanks. A victory, but a limited one. McNair's doctrine still held sway in most of the Army. The tank destroyer forces would still be the primary anti-armor weapon. The emphasis on the Sherman would not change, and most critically, production would be slow. The T-26E3 was not approved for mass production. It was approved for limited production. Tentatively, reluctantly, as if even Marshall's authority could not fully overcome the weight of institutional resistance. December 1943. The decision had been made. But it was too late to transform the American armored force before Normandy. Too late for the men who would die in Sherman tanks in 1944 because their doctrine said heavy tanks were unnecessary. The real reckoning would not come for another year. When it came, it would be in blood and snow, in the forests of Belgium and the Rhine Valley, in places no American had planned to be, against enemies no doctrine had adequately anticipated. The factories of America hummed with the sound of industrial war. Fisher Tank Arsenal in Detroit. Fisher Bodies Plant 23. The Detroit Tank Arsenal. Production lines that never stopped, that operated on 3 shifts, that poured out tanks by the hundreds. But the T26E1 was not among them. Not yet, anyway. While the Sherman flowed from American factories at rates that seemed almost impossible, the new tank remained in the realm of prototypes and limited trials. In the workshops where the T26E1 was being tested, the frustration was palpable. The tank was, by every objective measure, superior to the Sherman. The 900mm M3 gun, later standardized as the 90mm, was substantially more powerful than the Sherman's 75mm weapon. The armor was thicker, 4 inches of sloped frontal glacis plate, compared to the Sherman's 2.5 inches. The suspension system was more advanced. The transmission, though still causing some headaches, represented a step forward. Everything about the design said that here was the next generation. But next generation meant retooling factory lines. It meant retraining workers. It meant establishing entirely new supply chains for components. And in an army that had already committed to the Sherman, that had already designed tank destroyer doctrine around the Sherman's limitations, the T26E1 represented disruption. Bureaucratic inertia is among the most powerful forces in military organizations. It is more powerful than logic, more powerful than evidence. It is overcome only by catastrophe or exceptional authority. General Jacob Devers, the head of the armored force, was an exceptional advocate. In September and October of 1943, he pushed hard for T26E1 production. He had seen the specifications for the German Panther. He understood the implications. The Americans could not afford to fall behind in the tank arms race that was developing, a race that McNair denied was even happening, a race that the Russians and British understood perfectly well. The British were already deep in development of the Centurion tank, a 51-ton beast that would become one of the greatest tank designs of the century. The Soviets were responding to German heavy armor with the T-34-85 and the IS-2 tank. The arms race was real. Devers went over McNair's head. In December 1943, he made his case to General Marshall. The argument was the same argument that advocates for better tanks would make throughout the war. The Sherman was becoming inadequate. The future of the war in Europe would belong to those who could field heavy armor. The United States needed to begin production of the T-26E1 now, not in some distant future. Marshall listened. On December 16th, he made his decision. Production was authorized. 250 tanks. But victory in bureaucratic warfare is often illusory. While the production order had been issued, its implementation proceeded at a glacial pace. The T-26E1 did not begin full production until November 1944. In the meantime, McNair's influence remained strong. Further attempts were made to derail the T-26 program. The fact that these attempts failed was due primarily to continued support from Marshall and from General Dwight Eisenhower, who, as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, could see the implications of tank deficiencies more clearly than those in Washington. Eisenhower understood something that McNair did not want to admit. Tanks that can kill enemy tanks are worth more than doctrine. A man commanding an army in the field understands this in a way that a general commanding from Washington cannot. When tanks start dying at unacceptable rates Because their firepower is inadequate, a general with responsibility for victory must find a solution. Eisenhower's support kept the T-26 program alive when McNair's bureaucratic allies were trying to bury it. Meanwhile, the Sherman continued to roll off factory lines in vast quantities. By 1944, the United States was producing more tanks in a month than Germany produced in a year. The production curve was asymmetrical, reflecting the massive industrial advantages that America had brought to bear. The Army would produce over 2,000 M26 tanks by the end of the war. But in 1943 and early 1944, when these tanks could have made the difference in the campaign in France, they were not yet in production. The mathematics of industrial delay had written itself into the fate of the American tanker. December 1944. The forests of Belgium were thick with snow. The Americans had been advancing, slowly but steadily, pushing through France toward Germany, toward the Rhine, toward the German heartland. The war seemed to be drawing toward a conclusion. Germany was defeated. Everyone could see it. Germany was collapsing. The only question was how long it would take and how much blood would be spilled before the fighting ended. Then, on December 16th, everything changed. The German offensive, Operation Autumn Mist, the Germans called it. The Americans would call it the Ardennes Offensive, or the Battle of the Bulge, struck like a knife through American lines. 200,000 German soldiers poured through the American front. Panzer divisions, reformed from the Eastern Front and reinforced with new tanks, drove west toward Antwerp. The snow fell. The clouds hung low. American air superiority, which had been the shield behind which the land army had fought, became irrelevant. The Thunderbolts and Mustangs could not fly in these conditions. The German armor was free to rampage. American Sherman tanks, moving forward to engage the German spearhead, discovered something they already knew, but had chosen not to fully acknowledge. Their guns could not reliably penetrate German armor at combat ranges. A Sherman hitting a Panther in frontal engagement would bounce rounds off the sloped armor. The Panther's gun, the 7.5-centimeter KWK-40, could penetrate Sherman armor at 700 meters. The Sherman's 75mm gun struggled to penetrate Panther armor at 200 meters. The mathematics of the engagement were written in steel and blood. American tankers died. Tank after tank was knocked out. The Germans pressed forward. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge, after the German offensive had been halted, after the American lines had held despite the shock of the initial assault, American commanders began to calculate the cost. Hundreds of tanks had been destroyed. Thousands of American soldiers had been killed or wounded. The Tank Corps had taken a devastating blow. And in the postmortems, in the analysis of what had gone wrong, one fact emerged that could not be ignored. The M4 Sherman, the tank that McNair had championed, that the Army had committed to producing at massive scale, was simply inadequate when it faced German heavy armor. McNair himself would not live to see the consequences of his decisions. He would be killed 2 months later, in July 1945, by friendly fire in a bombing accident. But in December 1944, after the Battle of the Bulge, his doctrine was in ruins. The Army could no longer deny what the front was telling them. They needed a better tank, and they needed it now. Somewhere in storage, in depots and arsenals and transport yards, there were T26E3 tanks. The production was ramping up. 10 in November 1944, 30 in December, 70 in January 1945. It was not enough. It would never be enough to replace the Sherman in volume, but it might be enough to change the equation at the point of contact. When the T26E3 arrived in Europe, it could operate alongside the Sherman, providing the firepower that the Sherman could not. It could engage German heavy armor at ranges where the Sherman was helpless. It could kill. The decision was made. The T26E3 tanks would be shipped to Europe. On December 22, 1944, only 6 days after the beginning of the German offensive, the T26E3 tanks were ordered to be deployed to Europe. The American military was responding to catastrophe. The doctrine had failed. Now they would try force of arms, force of numbers, force of industrial capacity. The first shipment of Pershings, only 20 tanks, arrived at Antwerp in January 1945. It was a pittance compared to the thousands of Shermans already in Europe. But these 20 tanks represented something different. They represented an admission of error. They represented the hope that perhaps American industry and American firepower could overcome the consequences of American doctrine. January 1945. The new tanks arrived at the port of Antwerp like aliens from another world. The men of the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions, the units that would receive the first combat-deployed M26 Pershing tanks, had never seen anything like them. The tank was enormous compared to the Sherman. It sat higher off the ground, lower in profile, meaner somehow. The gun was substantially larger. The armor was visibly thicker. The stance of the vehicle communicated something that documents and specifications never could. This was a different kind of machine. The crews who had been fighting Shermans, men who had watched comrades die when their shells bounced off German armor, who had seen their tanks explode in flames when German shells found them, looked at the M26 with something between hunger and desperation. Finally, they would have something that could fight on equal terms. The Pershing displaced 46 short tons. Its 90mm M3 gun could fire armor-piercing rounds that would penetrate German armor at ranges where the Sherman was helpless. Its frontal armor was 4 inches thick at the glacis plate. It was not invulnerable. Nothing is invulnerable to an anti-tank gun or a skilled enemy crew, but it was substantially more survivable. The tanks were split between the divisions. The men began to familiarize themselves with the new vehicles. Training, gunnery practice, getting to know the machines that would, in the near future, determine whether they lived or died. The crews were careful with them. These tanks were not being produced in the quantities of the Sherman. They were scarce. Every tank mattered. Every tank represented hundreds of man-hours in factories thousands of miles away. The tankers could not know it yet, but they were receiving the vanguard of a transformation. Over 300 M26 Pershings would be shipped to Europe before VE Day. Not enough to replace the Sherman as the primary tank of the American armored force, but enough to fundamentally change the nature of tank combat. In the coming weeks and months, these tanks would encounter German armor in dozens of engagements. In nearly every case, the outcome would be the same. The Pershing would prevail. The 90mm gun would prove superior to anything the Germans had in their late-war inventory, except the King Tiger's most powerful variants. The armor would hold. The engine, though sometimes temperamental, would move the tank forward to the next engagement. But none of this was known yet. In January 1945, as the men of the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions took possession of the first combat M26 Pershings, they simply knew that they finally had a chance. Not a guarantee. Nothing guarantees victory in tank combat. But a chance, that was worth something. After months of fighting Shermans against German heavy armor, after watching friends die in one-sided engagements, the arrival of the Pershing represented hope. It represented vindication for those officers and tankers who had argued that a better tank was necessary. And it represented the beginning of the end for the doctrine that had delayed its arrival. The engineers and technicians of the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions began their work. They familiarized themselves with the Pershing's systems. The transmission operated differently than the Sherman's. The gun sight was more sophisticated. The engine, a Ford V8 derived from the GAF engine that powered some late-model Shermans, had its own quirks and requirements. The men learned, they mastered the machines, and they waited for combat. In the frozen landscape of Belgium and Germany, in the weeks following the arrival of the first M26 Pershings, American commanders and tankers alike were about to witness the revelation that their military bureaucracy had resisted for 2 years, that a better tank, deployed in sufficient numbers, could change the balance of armored warfare. The doctrine of delay had failed. The time had come for the doctrine of offense. The time had come to unleash what American industry had built. The revelation was about to begin. February 25, 1945. Near the Roer River, in the sector held by the 9th Armored Division. The first M26 Pershing tanks were about to see combat. The men of Easy Company, embedded with the tank crews, knew that this moment would define everything. They had trained on these machines for only a few weeks. The manuals were still new. Some procedures were not yet fully understood. But there was no time for perfect mastery. The war was accelerating. The Germans were retreating, but they were not yet defeated. They still had armor. They still had men. They still had the will to fight. The engagement began as most tank engagements do. Suddenly, a German anti-tank position, cunningly concealed in the rubble of a destroyed village, opened fire on an advancing Sherman. The shell struck true. The Sherman erupted in flames. The crew, 4 men who had survived months of combat together, died in seconds. Their names were recorded in unit logs. Their bodies were processed through burial details. Their deaths became statistics in a war that had already consumed millions. The Pershing Company commander made a decision. He would move his tanks forward to suppress the anti-tank position. The Pershings advanced, their engines roaring with a different tone than the Shermans, deeper, more powerful, more menacing. The gunners traversed their turrets, searching for the German position. The commander of the lead Pershing, call sign Eagle 1, spotted the muzzle flash of the anti-tank gun. He spoke into the radio. The words were brief, professional, entirely devoid of the drama that would attach itself to the moment in retrospect. Target acquired. Engaging. The Pershing's 90mm gun fired. The report was sharper than the Sherman's 75mm. The recoil more pronounced. The shell traveled downrange at nearly 3,000 feet per second. It struck the German anti-tank position. The explosion was tremendous. The German gun was destroyed. The crew was annihilated. The engagement lasted perhaps 30 seconds from first contact to destruction of the target. For the first time in the European campaign, American tankers had engaged a German anti-tank position with confidence, knowing that their gun had the power to destroy it. This was the revelation that McNair's doctrine had denied, that firepower matters, that when you have a gun that can reliably penetrate enemy armor, and the enemy has a gun that cannot penetrate yours, the mathematics of the engagement are weighted heavily in your favor. The Pershing crew understood this immediately. They had felt it in the recoil of the gun, seen it in the destruction of the target, sensed it in the morale surge that ran through the entire company. This tank could fight. This tank could win. Over the next weeks, as the 9th Armored Division pushed deeper into Germany, the Pershings continued to accumulate combat experience. Every engagement added to the database of knowledge about what the tank could do. The 90mm gun proved itself superior to the Sherman's 75mm in every important metric: penetration, velocity, destructive power. The armor held in engagements where Sherman armor would have failed. The tank itself, 46 tons of steel and engine and firepower, became a symbol of American industrial capacity. But the true test would come when the Pershings faced their German counterparts. the Panthers, the Tigers, the vehicles that had haunted Sherman crews, that had killed thousands of American soldiers, that represented the peak of German engineering. That test was coming. It was only a matter of time. March 6, 1945. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. The bridge is a steel cantilever structure designed to carry rail traffic across the Rhine. By early 1945, it represented something more than its function suggested. It represented a crossing point into Germany, an opportunity to establish a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Rhine before German forces could organize a defense. The 3rd Armored Division, driving hard to the east, reached the bridge before the Germans could destroy it. The structure was still intact, still passable. American forces crossed in a rush, seeking to establish a foothold before German reinforcements arrived. And they did arrive, not immediately, but within hours. German tanks, moving to contain the American breakthrough, were converging on the bridge. Among the German vehicles was a Panther tank. The Panther is one of the most formidable tank designs ever created. 100 meters long with the gun extended, sloped armor that could deflect shells at angles that would penetrate vertical armor, a 7.5-centimeter gun that was substantially more powerful than the Sherman's weapons. The Panther had become the standard German medium tank by 1945, produced in large numbers, feared by American tankers. The American response was a T26E3 Pershing tank, call sign Eagle 7. The crew was commanded by Corporal Clarence Smoyer, a gunner whose name would later become associated with this engagement. Smoyer had approximately 30 seconds of gunnery training before his tank saw combat. He had learned the 90mm gun as he fought it. Now, on the streets of Cologne near the bridge, he would face his greatest test. The Panther appeared at the end of a street, perhaps 900 yards distant. The distance was close enough that both tanks could engage with confidence. Smoyer, in the gun turret of Eagle 7, acquired the target. He could see the distinctive profile of the Panther, could see the gun turret traversing toward him. Time contracted in the way it does in combat. Moments became hours, seconds became eternities. Smoyer loaded an armor-piercing round. He laid the gun on the Panther's hull, adjusting for the slight angle. He fired. The Pershing bucked with the recoil. Downrange, the round struck the Panther's armor and penetrated. The impact was catastrophic. The round passed through the armor, through the fighting compartment, and struck something vital inside. The Panther erupted. Fire poured from the hatch. The turret was blown sideways by the internal explosion. The tank, only moments before a deadly threat, had become a burning coffin. Smoyer, the gunner, did not celebrate. This was combat. This was the job. Other German tanks were moving. Other threats were developing. But in that moment, in that engagement, something fundamental had changed. An American tank had engaged a German Panther at 900 yards and destroyed it with a single shot. The word spread through the American forces like a surge of electricity. The Pershing could fight. The Pershing could win. The engagement near Remagen was not unique. Over the following weeks, Pershing tanks would destroy multiple German Panthers and at least one Tiger I. But the Remagen engagement, or more precisely, the engagements near Cologne involving Eagle 7 and other Pershings, became emblematic. They became the proof that American tankers had been denied for 2 years, that a better tank could defeat the German armor that had ravaged Sherman formations. March 19, 1945. General Gladian M. Barnes, Chief of Research and Development for Army Ordnance, arrived in Europe on a mission that would later be called the Zebra Mission. His purpose was simple: to evaluate the performance of the M26 Pershing in combat and determine whether the design required modifications or improvements. Barnes was not a front-line officer. He was an engineer, a scientist, a man whose entire career had been devoted to the technical challenges of tank warfare. He had advocated for the T-26 design years earlier, had fought bureaucratic battles on behalf of heavy armor, had watched with professional frustration as McNair's doctrine had delayed production. Now, as he traveled through Germany in the wake of the advancing American armies, he had the opportunity to see the fruits of his work in action. The reports he received were consistent. Pershing tanks were outperforming German heavy armor in direct engagements. The 90mm gun was proving superior to anything the Germans had in their inventory. The armor was holding up. The tank's design was vindicated by combat experience. But Barnes understood something that not all officers understood. The real victory was not in the individual engagements. The real victory was in the revelation of industrial capacity. The Pershing represented not just a better tank, but a different philosophy of production. The United States could build better tanks than Germany. The United States could build them in sufficient quantity to matter. The United States could iterate on designs, improve them, deploy them to combat. The Germans, by contrast, were on a constant defensive, constantly trying to defend what they had built, constantly losing ground to an enemy that had unlimited resources. The mathematics were becoming clear to every observer who cared to look. Germany had produced approximately 13,000 Tiger and Panther tanks combined, heavy tanks that represented the state of German engineering. The United States, by war's end, would produce over 2,000 M26 Pershings. But more importantly, the United States was producing over 10,000 M4 Shermans. When you combined the Shermans with the Pershings, when you factored in the artillery support, the air support, the infantry divisions, the supply lines, the ammunition production, the replacement parts, when you looked at the totality of American industrial capacity, the outcome of the war was not a matter of military skill or tactical brilliance. It was a matter of industrial mathematics. A Panther tank could kill a Sherman. A single German crew, well-trained and well-positioned, could destroy multiple American tanks. But no amount of skill could overcome the fact that for every Panther that was destroyed, 2 Pershings would arrive to replace it. For every Tiger that killed 5 Shermans, 10 new Shermans would arrive from American factories. The Germans were fighting an enemy that did not merely have equal industrial capacity, they had infinite industrial capacity compared to what Germany could produce. General Barnes understood this. He also understood something else, that the delayed deployment of the Pershing had cost American lives. That McNair's doctrine, though internally logical and coherent, had been catastrophically wrong about the requirements of tank warfare. That had 200 T26E3 tanks been deployed in Normandy in June 1944, as Devers had wanted, as some far-sighted officers had argued for, the campaign in France might have unfolded very differently. The tank crews might not have suffered the losses they did against German armor. The momentum might have shifted sooner. But dwelling on what might have been was a luxury that soldiers in wartime could not afford. What mattered now was what was. What mattered was that the Pershing was here, performing as designed, proving the wisdom of those who had advocated for its development and deployment. What mattered was that American industry was winning the war not through technological superiority. The Germans were, in many cases, ahead of American technology, but through industrial capacity, the ability to produce more, to replace losses faster, to overwhelm the enemy through sheer weight of production. May 7, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The European war was over. In the immediate aftermath, the military began its own reckoning with the decisions that had been made over the previous 4 years. The McNair doctrine was thoroughly discredited. Tank destroyers would still exist in post-war American military doctrine, but they would no longer be elevated to the primary anti-armor role. The lesson had been learned. written in blood and steel at a cost of thousands of American lives. The Pershing's combat record spoke for itself. The First and Third Armies had deployed roughly 300 M26 Pershings in the final months of the war. Tank crews in Pershings engaged German armor with confidence that Sherman crews could never achieve. The gun was superior. The armor was superior. The tank's design had proven itself in combat against the best armor that Germany could field. 37 Pershings had been lost in combat, a loss rate that was high by any standard, but not so high as to undermine the overall success of the design. The tankers who survived the war, who had fought in Pershings in the Rhine Valley and the valleys beyond, carried with them the knowledge of what that tank could do. They had seen its gun destroy German armor. They had felt its armor save their lives. They had experienced the transformation from fighting in a tank that was outgunned and under-armored to fighting in a tank that could engage enemy armor on equal or superior terms. That experience would shape the post-war development of American armor. The tragedy was not in the Pershing itself. The tank was superb, but in the delay. The 20 tanks that arrived in January 1945 were a beginning, a proof of concept. But had production begun in 1943 or early 1944, as some had advocated, hundreds of Pershings might have been in Europe for the Normandy campaign. The losses in the summer and fall of 1944, when Sherman crews were being ground up against German heavy armor, might have been substantially reduced. The momentum of the campaign might have shifted sooner. The war might have ended sooner. The blood cost would have been lower. But history is not a matter of what might have been. History is a matter of what was. And what was that the M26 Pershing arrived in Europe in January 1945, proved its worth in combat, and became a symbol of what American industry could produce when given the opportunity and the necessity. 300 tanks, deployed in the final 4 months of the European War, changed the nature of tank combat. They proved that the Sherman was not the ultimate expression of American tank design. They proved that American industry, once unleashed, could overcome any deficit. They proved that McNair's doctrine, no matter how internally logical, had been catastrophically wrong about the requirements of modern warfare. In the immediate post-war period, the Pershing was redesignated the M26 Pershing. The prefix changed from medium to heavy, acknowledging what everyone already knew, that this was a heavy tank in all but name. Production continued after the war. The design would be continuously improved, leading eventually to the M47 Patton, the M48 Patton, and all the post-war American medium tanks that would define American armor doctrine for the next 2 decades. The legacy of the Pershing was not limited to what it accomplished in 1945. It was foundational to everything that came after. The mathematics of defeat that McNair had ignored, the fact that a numerically superior force with superior armor and firepower would, in the long run, always defeat a numerically superior force with inferior armor and firepower, became the foundational principle of post-war American tank design. Every subsequent American tank design, from the M47 through the M48, through the M60, and eventually to the M1 Abrams, was built on the understanding that firepower and protection must keep pace with firepower and protection requirements, not fall behind them in pursuit of some abstract doctrine. The story of the M26 Pershing is, at its heart, a story about the consequences of ignoring evidence. General McNair ignored the evidence that German armor was becoming more formidable. He ignored the evidence from the Soviet-German War that heavy armor was becoming dominant. He ignored the evidence from his own ordnance officers that the Sherman was becoming inadequate. He ignored these things not because he was stupid — McNair was a highly intelligent officer — but because he was committed to a doctrine, and doctrines have the power to blind intelligent men to obvious truths. By the time the doctrine was discredited, by the time McNair's errors were acknowledged. Thousands of American tankers had died in Shermans that lacked the firepower or protection to survive engagements with German armor. Had the M26 Pershing arrived earlier, had production begun in 1943, had deployment begun in 1944, had McNair's doctrine been overruled sooner, those deaths might have been prevented. The war might have ended sooner. The outcome, inevitable though it was, might have been achieved at a lower cost in blood. But there is another story hidden within this story, a story that is perhaps more important than the narrative of doctrinal error and vindication. It is a story about industrial capacity and what industrial capacity means in modern warfare. The Pershing was not the most advanced tank in the world in 1945. The German King Tiger, with its more powerful gun and superior armor, was arguably superior. The Soviet IS-2 tank was comparable. But the Pershing did not have to be the most advanced tank in the world. It only had to be better than anything Germany could produce in quantity. And more importantly, the United States could build Pershings in large numbers. The United States could replace losses. The United States could iterate on designs, improve them, deploy new versions. Germany could not. This was the revelation that the Pershing represented. Not just that a better tank could defeat a worse tank, but that industrial capacity, unlimited, vast, overwhelming industrial capacity, was the ultimate determinant of victory in industrial war. Germany had produced excellent tanks. Germany had produced tactical victories. But Germany could not produce industrial capacity. And so, in the end, Germany lost. The Pershing, arriving late, proved what American industry had always been capable of producing. It proved that once American industrial capacity was fully unleashed, once American factories were converted entirely to war production, there was no power on earth that could defeat it. The tankers who fought in Pershings understood this. They may not have articulated it in the abstract language of industrial capacity and production statistics, but they felt it in their bones. They felt it in the superiority of the tank they were driving. They felt it in the confidence that came from knowing their gun could penetrate enemy armor at ranges where the enemy gun could barely scratch their own armor. They felt it in the knowledge that if their tank was destroyed, another tank would arrive to replace it. This confidence, multiplied across hundreds of tanks and thousands of crews, became the foundation of American military victory in Europe. On May 7, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, the Pershing had been in combat for less than 3 months. But in those 3 months, it had proven its worth beyond question. The doctrine that had delayed its arrival had been thoroughly discredited. The officers and engineers who had fought for heavy tank production had been vindicated. And the stage had been set for the entire post-war development of American armor, which would be built on the understanding that the Pershing had provided, that a heavier, better armed, better protected tank was not a luxury, but a necessity. The story of the M26 Pershing is, ultimately, the story of how American industry won the Second World War. Not through revolutionary technology. American technology was, in many cases, a step behind German or Soviet technology, but through industrial capacity, through the ability to produce more,